The Blade itself is the first entry in the Grimdark trilogy, The First Law, which is written by Joe Abercrombie and is loved by many. It's kind of the quintessential modern Grimdark fantasy, outside of Song of Ice and Fire. There's tons of fans for this series and they're very vocal. It's been suggested to me by viewers, my girlfriend loves it, even on Reddit, it ranks second behind only Middle-earth on the top list of fantasy series. I love dark fantasy, but in the book space, I've mostly just stuck to epic fantasy, so I decided it was definitely time to dive into some Grimdark, and this seemed like the perfect place to start. So I'll go over all the things I liked about the book, some things I didn't like, the characters, the plot, the world, and then I'll go ahead and put a score out of 5 on it at the end here. Before we get too far into this, I want to kind of talk about Grimdark and what it is and why people classify this as Grimdark. Joe Abercrombie actually has the title Lord Grimdark, which is kind of jokingly given to himself, and it sounds like he regrets giving himself that title now, but people have kind of run with it and, called this series that. But for me, what it really is the morality of the characters, all about them and who we follow. Here, all the characters are pretty morally gray. And at the start of the second part of the book here, there's a pretty great quote that kind of describes this situation that most of our characters are kind of fighting. Life, the way it really is a battle not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. And that so well describes what most all the characters here in the world of the First Law are going through. In addition to the moral grayness of it all, the world here and the way Joe describes everything is just so filthy and grimy. He uses like piss and shit to describe so many of like the way that people smell or the streets or things like that. People are just covered in grime. They're filthy. The world, just reading it and the way he describes everything, almost everything just felt grungy and filthy and dirty and just lived in. And I feel like in a lot of that fantasy, you just get this super clean kind of look to everything, or just everything just feels so perfect and pristine. But here you just get this, everybody's just covered in muck and sweat and filth, and Logan hasn't showered in a month, stuff like that. And that just lends to this gritty, dark world that Joe's really constructing here. One of the things I've heard for a long time is Joe Abercrombie's greatest strength is the character writing. And primarily, I'm a character-first reader, so I was really eager to see what was going to be on display here for me, and the cast here is fantastic. There's 3 main characters that we follow in the First Law. The first being Logan Ninefingers, who's kind of a barbarian from the north. He's trying to leave his past behind him. He's done some heinous crimes, some horrible stuff before. He has the name the Bloody Nine. That's how people kind of know him in the north too. He's a legendary kind of badass, but he wants to leave all that savagery behind him and just live a more normal life. And he very well understands how close he is to death at any given moment. Even in little scuffles, he always talks to himself, still alive, still alive, still alive. Every day for Logan is a battle between life and death, and he knows any little slip up can cause him to die. After that, we have our character Giselle Dan Luther, who is kind of like Lord Farquaad or Prince Charming from Shrek. That's kind of how I envision him in my mind. This character, we get a part with him. He's a upperclassman who lives in the Union, at the heart of the Union, which is under the king, so he lives right in the center of the lands. And during this book, we get a part where Giselle literally talks about how the highlight of his day is the start of the day, looking at himself in the mirror and how damn good he looks. So that just gives you a great vision of how selfish this guy is, how self-centered he is. A lot of his goals are just driven around, I wanted to be an important figure in life. And that's just kind of what drives him. He just wants to have this importance. And it really does highlight kind of just this nobility and not really knowing what you want to do, but just trying to be, people bow down before you. The last of our main characters is Sandan Glokta, who's also a nobleman, and he's actually one of the most celebrated soldiers in the Union. But he definitely follows this trope of a fall from grace. And this man has lost it all. He is a shell of his former self. He was like the best swordsman, the best fighter in the Union, which is the main political area we follow in this novel. And he was taken by the enemy during the war and tortured. And he's come back. He's a cripple now, and he's got a limp. He's got most of his teeth are taken out. He's had a very tough life since the war, and he's now part of the King's Inquisition, where he serves as an inquisitor, which means that he tortures people. He has a couple of practicals who help him torture people and get people, and he gets answers. And sometimes he gets people to say things that aren't necessarily true, but will allow him to go further down the path of getting the answers that he needs from the right people. So these is just a really interesting group of 3 characters to follow. Initially, they are pretty far apart in the world, but by the end of the book, the threads come together. And I love that when you have these POV characters that are separate, but then they come together and they all have very distinct character voices. That's the thing that Joe absolutely nails, is the prose around these characters and each of their chapters or segments of the chapters where it follows them is so distinct from one another. Their internal dialogue, the way they speak, the way they think, you get it all just in the writing, and you don't even need to know whose POV chapter it is. Just the way that is written, you can tell who you're following. It is so well done. It really only took me a couple chapters with Logan and Glock to each to really make me understand what makes them tick, how they operate, and their past. Logan really talks about so much in reference to things he knows from his past life, and it just paints a very vivid picture of this character that's went through so many tough times. And for Glockta, it really made me feel this character who has lost his purpose, who's hunting for purpose. He's questioned himself, why am I doing these things? But he just does them because that's all the direction he has in life right now. I want to read this section to you now, between Logan and this character, Baez, who's a magus. And it's kind of talking about this other character, Bethod, who's the King of the North, who Logan has served in the past. Just listen to this writing and you'll kind of immediately just understand what a practical man Logan is and who he's become now. Ah, reasons. Baez looked down at his teacup. And what of your reasons? Does this feud not cut both ways? Perhaps. But you are willing to wait? I'll have to be. You are very patient for a Northman. Logan thought of Bethod and his loathsome sons, and the many good men they'd killed for their ambitions. The men he'd killed for their ambitions. He thought of the Shanka and his family, and the ruins of their village by the sea. He thought of all his dead friends. He sucked at his teeth and stared at the fire. I've settled a few scores in my time, but only led to more. Vengeance can feel fine, but it's a luxury. It doesn't fill your belly or keep the rain off. To fight my enemies, I need friends to be behind me, and I'm clean out of friends. You have to be realistic. It's been a while since my ambitions went beyond getting through each day alive. Besides the main cast, there's a couple other POV characters, with one named the Dogman, who kind of follows this group of exiles. They're named men, which are people from the north that are very powerful warriors. Logan Ninefingers was actually the leader of that crew before, with the title The Bloody Nine. So they all have these names, and we get to follow him for probably like 2 or 3 chapters. And then there's another character, Pharaoh, who we follow quite a bit, and she's from the south. She lives a pretty brutal life, but she is definitely going to play a pretty big role going forward, and she kind of ties in with the main cast more later on in the book. And then the last one that I really want to mention, I'll get to one more of the POV characters. There's another POV character, which is Colum West, and he's friends with Giselle, and he also has a relationship with Glockta, and him and his sister play into this book quite a bit, and he's actually... It seems like he's probably the most morally good character out of all of them, but this man's also layered and he's got some stuff going on, and you get through some of these POV chapters with him, and something happened that was one of the most surprising things in the book for me around his character and his sister. So that was all really great to read. And then lastly here, I do want to mention Baez, who is not a POV character. I've mentioned all the POV characters. There's 6 in total, I believe, with 3 major ones. Baez is the first of the Magi, and he serves that kind of wise wizard trope like Gandalf or somebody like that. But Baez is pretty funny because he is kind of very smug, and he's kind of an asshole to a lot of people. He tries to keep his temper, but sometimes he just snaps and loses it, and also is sarcastic and will like lie to people. just because he thinks he's so far above them. And the book doesn't really talk about how old Baez is, but as you go through the book and start to learn more of the world, you realize, oh wow, this dude, he's been alive for, like, it doesn't even make sense almost for how long this guy has been alive. So there's a lot of fun around that with Glock kind of looking into this character and figuring out, is this the Baez who he really is? That's some of the most fun stuff in the book here. So the overall character writing, the chemistry between characters, the character dialogue, it's all great. And sometimes it takes me a while to warm up to characters, but here, basically everybody right off the bat got going. I will say that Joe has this very distinct humor, this wit that he writes with, and it helps because what's happening in the book is rather dark. A lot of the stuff that happens is pretty dark, but the way he writes, it brings this like cutting wit to it that makes it feel light enough that it's easy enough to push through and keep going. You don't feel too bogged down by all this nihilism or darkness. It's light enough that it's fun and enjoyable to read too. I will say though that I think I've heard that Glock is a lot of people's favorite characters, and I do like Glock a lot. I think in this first book, Logan is probably my favorite character. Glock took a little bit of time for me to warm up to because in his chapters and his POV moments, there's a lot of internal speech with this character. He talks a lot to people, but he's thinking a lot in his head, and he'll like say a sentence to somebody and then say the rest of it just in his head, and it'll be like italics in the book, so you can very easily tell the two different things apart. But he thinks he knows everybody. He thinks he knows how they operate, what they're thinking, who they really are, that they're a fraud, all these things, that they're a cheater. So he'll say all this in his head and just be brooding about all of it while he's talking with them and thinks that they're insufferable. So that's pretty fun, but I did find it a bit grating initially. I got over that hump after about 30% of the way through the book, and then I really came to enjoy his character as well. Also, when you start to kind of learn more about Glock's past, what he's gone through, it's interesting to see where he's come from and where he is now. Because really, Jazal is a pretty good model of what Glockta was before. And even Glockta kind of knows that. He reflects on saying, was I any really different than Jazal? Because Glockta absolutely despises Jazal. These two get quite a bit of interaction because they're both in the capital city of Ardwa, where a lot of the story takes place. One thing I'll mention here too, because otherwise people will probably comment and tell me to listen to the audiobook, is that the audiobook for this is fantastic. It's done by the narrator, Stephen Pacey, and he does a fantastic job with all the characters. The voice is just so fitting for this grimdark world, and with Glockta especially, is one of the areas that he does the best. Because as I mentioned, Glockta has all this internal dialogue, and then he also talks quite a bit too. So Stephen has two different voices for Glockta. He has the voice that he uses in Glockta's head, like the narrator's speech, and then Glockta, since he's missing teeth, has a lisp. So Pacey nails that lisp when Glockta is doing dialogue with others. So there's two distinct voices that you get for Glockta, which is really fascinating and just adds a ton to the audiobook here. And I did bounce between the audiobook and the physical book, so I got to experience the book in both formats, and it was great both ways. Now I want to kind of talk about my biggest issue with this book, and then I'll keep going on some of the stuff I liked. The first 30% of this book, I think I was just kind of jaded and not the best mood, because it took me a while to really start liking it and enjoying it a lot. There was definitely some friction there with me between the humor and kind of how some of the stuff was written with Glockta, and just like, where's this all going? Because one common criticism of the Blade itself is about the plot, that it's kind of meandering. But as we got further through the book, I started putting the pieces together, and I kind of see now where things are going. A lot of the plot is kind of, I think if you reread the trilogy, I haven't read the other two books yet, but I'm feeling that on a reread, you're going to see a lot of these connections, and the first book's going to be like, oh wow, there is the plot there, and the main thing's actually kind of happening without a lot being said. And near the end of the book, you do get a lot more hints at what kind of the plot here. All I'll say is a lot of it revolves around what Baez is trying to do, and these characters are all tied to Baez, and it's not immediately apparent, but then by the end of the book and some of our characters kind of overhear some of the things he's saying, it becomes more apparent that he's leading them down this path. And I'll just talk about plot now. I think that the way that Joe wrote this, it actually does a good job with the plot, where you feel like these characters, where you're in the dark, the reader's in the dark, and they don't really know where Baez is leading them. And that's how the characters feel, and that's how you feel as a reader. And that's what I'm saying, maybe upon reflection, after going down and seeing what Baez leads these characters through down the line, and then coming back to this book, I bet you it's going to look awesome, seeing how everything came together. But that's how you feel in this one. You feel in the dark. You kind of feel like you're just going along with these characters, just trying to survive, get through the next day, and then ultimately end up kind of connected by the end of things here. The one that did have the most kind of direct plot of his own was Glokta. In this book, he spends a lot of time investigating goings-on in the Union around the Traders Guild, the Mercers Guild. And I feel like Glokta is starting to get led down this path of wanting to hunt for truth. That's what I'll say here around it, and I'm very interested to see where his character goes and how he kind of connects back to this character of Baez in the later entries. I'll also talk about the world here, because in a lot of fantasy books and sci-fi books, the world building is something that people tend to love. Here, it did enough for me. Initially, I thought it was pretty solid, not a lot of crazy things going on. Some of the naming is pretty funny for things, like there's this place called Angland. It's like England with an A, so that was kind of funny. And then the like kind of country in the center where the Union's based, where most of the story takes place, is called Middlerland. It's because that country's literally in the middle of the world. And then like the whole world itself is called the Circle of the World, and there's a Circle C. So these things have pretty literal names a lot of the time. That's kind of funny. So there was enough going on. There's these beasts that are called Shanka that you kind of get involved with very early on with Logan and some of the other Northman characters. And I'm interested to see where things go with the Shanka there. They seem like pretty savage beasts. Really, the main cool stuff that started happening with the plot was with Baez, the first of the Magi, when you start getting involved with him. And then at the very last, like 70% of the book, a lot of the cool world building stuff happens, where you learn way more about the past. It seems like there's a lot more there to dive into, and just some really cool mysterious stuff. And this more epic scale gets start to build up, because I didn't really know how big the scope of the events in this series would be. And now I can see that there might be some serious like world level threats that will be going on here. And I'm definitely curious to see where that goes. And I think that's where I'm going to tie up my thoughts here for the spoiler-free section. I'm not really going to do a spoiler section on this one either. Maybe when I read the whole series, I'll go back and do a whole spoiler review for the series. But I'm going to go ahead and give The Blade itself a 4.25 out of 5. I really enjoyed this one, and I think going forward, now that I really like the characters, it seems like there's more direction going forward. I anticipate I'm just going to like this even more and more as we go forward. So that's about it. If you like this review, check out the channel. I do a bunch of reviews on fantasy and sci-fi books over there, and just kind of talk about some fun stuff related to reading. Otherwise, have a good one.